Hey, Christopher. The last few months have been fun, but I gotta start making videos again. So this video actually starts quite a long time ago, but even before what you see here, I had done some work. So let's go back and see what that was. After completing the frame, I had to clean up these feet and get them on, but the plating process had left a bunch of residue in the threads, so I basically had to re-tap all of them, and you can see that process here. And I had to do the same thing on the front of the frame for this piece right here, which covers up all the internals from the front. Several months later, I came back to the project and the whole thing was covered in disgusting spider webs. So I had to clean everything, including my workbench, but because I live in Winnipeg and it was wintertime, my Lysol got frozen to the bench. All the screws and nuts on this thing had either a lot of corrosion or scale, so I needed to replace most of them. These group head bolts I found at Home Depot, and these motor bolts I also found at Home Depot, and they had locking nuts on the bottom. And after tightening the motor down, securing it in place, I thought it would be a good idea to get the boiler in so I could start attaching all the pipes. The boiler was a bit tricky because the nuts attach from the bottom, so I used a tamper to lift up the frame and get the boiler attached. Next, I piled all the pieces onto my workbench and started to sort through them, but because it had been so long, I actually had forgotten where things go. So I pulled up an old video and watched to see where all the pieces went. Now at this point, it just became a giant puzzle and finding where things went and putting it back together. But life got in the way again, and I had to put this project aside. So it's been a few months since I've worked on this project. And even though I'm really busy with my full-time job, my 3 little children, a big part of the reason why I haven't been working on it is because of a mental block. When you have a project as big and as complicated as this one, you can begin to feel overwhelmed and doubt your skill and whether you can actually complete the project. So in this video, my goal is to take it one step and one piece at a time and begin to reassemble this thing and tackle the issues as they come up rather than worrying about the overarching scope of the project. I want to be honest with all you who are watching. This thing is quite daunting. There's a lot of pieces and lots of potential for mistakes. And when something is going out to the world, you start to wonder whether it's worth it to actually complete the project on camera. I'd often thought about, what if I just finish it and don't finish this video series? But I think it was important for me to document this. And speaking of documenting things, in this episode, I haven't taken all that much time to really go over exactly what I'm putting together and what each little piece of this thing does. So if that's something that you're interested in, I will take that into consideration for the next video. And if there's enough comments and enough interest, I could just do a separate video explaining what each piece of this thing does. So if that's something that interests you, leave a comment down below. So whoever was working on this machine before me had cut a cork gasket for the end of the boiler and one for the water level switch at the back, but they didn't cut one for the heating element, so I had to cut one out of silicone. But I forgot to record myself doing that, so you'll just have to trust me that it's there. The work that you're seeing right now has been sped up to about 800% of real time. There was countless hours spent figuring out which pieces go in the right spot and how they go together. But that's only part of the process of reassembling this thing, because you always run into these little issues, including what I'm about to show you. So the next thing to connect to the machine is the pressure gauge. Now, there's two problems with this one. The first is it's very broken, and the second is that it sat too far back and actually didn't sit flush with the front panel. So I got a new one, and this one's Elektra branded, looks beautiful. Now the problem is that it has different connections, and I don't think this is original, because the fitting that's on here is actually a flared fitting instead of one of these fittings. Now, this pressure gauge does not accept flared fittings, and it's also too short. So what I'm going to do is I've got pipe from a donor machine, and this is the right size fitting with the right size nut. And very conveniently, this pipe, the inner diameter actually can accept the outer diameter of this pipe. So I'm going to just sand this down, get this in here, solder it together to create a new pipe, and I'll be able to make it to the length that it needs to be, and should be fine. So I used a very crude method of painter's tape and a pen to approximate how much of the pipe I needed to cut. But I knew that if I cut the whole thing oversize, that I'd be okay to bend it into the right spot afterwards. Now this next part, where I'm cutting the pipe, was nerve-wracking, I'm not gonna lie. Because you only get one shot at it, and if you mess it up, you're kind of screwed. I forgot to record this part, but I essentially needed to drill out the larger pipe, just a touch, and then sand down the inner pipe, which I did record, to get them to fit. So now I'm just adding a bit of flux and joining the pieces together, and it's time to solder. So I didn't have any propane on me, but I did have some MAP gas, which burns a little hotter, but will do the trick. So the idea is that you heat the pipe that you want the solder to go into, and then capillary action will suck the solder into it. And this was actually a lot easier than I thought it would be, and I'm really happy with how the joint came out. After the solder was cooled, I just took it off the joint and cleaned it up a little bit, and then I had to spend a lot of time fiddling with these pipes to get them in the right spot. And the end result is a functioning pressure gauge. So the next step in the process is to pressure test for leaks. And the way I do this is using compressed air. I'm going to be using the line for the pressure stat to check for leaks. And as you can see and hear, there was a pretty significant leak when I first started, which turned out to be the boiler safety valve. And so after tightening that up, I chased a whole bunch of other leaks, and what I ended up with is what you see here. 1 bar of pressure and no leaks. Perfect. So I finished pressure testing the boiler side and buttoned up every leak that I could find, and then moved on to the heat exchanger side of the system. So I hooked up this pipe here and started pressure testing, and I had some leaks in the group heads, managed to get rid of those with some plumber's tape. And the other major area was actually down here where this was. Initially I didn't know exactly what this was for, but turns out it's a check valve. And when I opened up the valve itself, there is a piece of plastic and a gasket that were completely ruined. Replacement pieces for this particular check valve were actually quite difficult to come by, and new ones were about 90 bucks. So I decided to remanufacture the piece on the inside using 1/2 inch brass rod and some standard off-the-shelf O-rings. It took me an hour to do with a drill and a die grinder, but for 15 bucks and a little bit of elbow grease, I think it was worth it. And here is the finished piece. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And so now I can stick this gasket on there, spring on this side. And that's it. So water flows this way and prevents any hot water from going back that way by the gasket and the spring. So after testing the check valve, I moved on to testing the pressure of the pump assembly. This is the original pump that came with the machine, and when I hooked it up and pressure tested it, there was a leak right here, which is no good. And I looked online to see if I could find any rebuild kits for these pumps, but I couldn't find anything reasonably priced. So I swapped in this pump here, which came from a parts machine. And when I hooked it up, this adjustment screw was leaking. So when I opened it up, there's a gasket in here that was the culprit. However, I didn't have anything that was the right size, so I slapped an O-ring that was about 1 millimeter larger. And while it doesn't leak, I'm not sure if the adjustment screw works. And the other thing is that I'm not sure if this pump is any good because it came from a pretty grungy machine, even though I cleaned it. So just to be sure that I can move on with the project, I purchased this off Marketplace today. And it is a motor and pump assembly. And if you can believe it, I only paid $75 for this. So this thing is practically brand new, and you can't actually buy these without buying like 10 of them. They're for, they're made for large coffee chains and whatnot. So this is a high-end stainless steel rotary vane pump. And if this doesn't work, then I'll swap to this. I might even just swap this in eventually because it's much nicer. So after making 2 new lines, rebuilding a check valve, troubleshooting pumps, and triple checking every single fitting on this thing, I am now ready to move on to the electrical. And that's really exciting because after the electrical's done, then I can turn it on for the first time and make some coffee. Oh, getting there. Stay tuned.